we're good. So what was the bell? Briefly, I believe the Bell story to be the true basis, the ultimate basis, as it were, behind the Nazi UFO flying saucer legend. And again, these are the points I'll be talking about during this part of the presentation, just to kind of give you a heads up for those of you taking notes so that you can kind of follow along if you're following the outline in your notes. All right, let's talk about Bell basics. Obviously, it's shaped like a bell. The Germans called it Die Glocke, the bell. It stands roughly 15 to 18 feet tall, about 12 to 15 feet wide. It's cylindrical shaped like a bell. Its configuration is such that on the inside there are two counter-rotating drums, which, unlike Nick Cook and Igor Vitkovsky, I believe were stacked one on top of the other. Inside of these cylinders, on the interior surface as they're being spun up, and in the actual center of the Bell device, the Germans would put a fluid that they had codenamed IRR Serum 525. Now, this is described as having been of reddish maroon color, and I'll mention who's doing the describing here in a moment, of reddish maroon color, of very heavy density, of heavy weight, and we don't really know the ingredients of it, but I suspect that since it's a liquid, probably mercury is involved, some isotope of mercury. And I also suspect that they were using thorium-229 isomer. And I'll explain why. An isomer is simply a radioactive isotope whose nucleus is in an extremely high state of spin. And when it slows down from that high state of spin, it releases an enormous burst of gamma rays, okay? Now, thorium-229 isomer just happens to be one of those isomers whose excitation threshold is very low. In other words, it's very easy to get it to slow down and release all these gamma ray bursts, okay? The Bell was also cryogenically cooled by either liquid nitrogen or liquid oxygen. There's a little bit of variance in the story, but the common element is that it was cooled down to an extremely low temperature. And again, if you know anything about the recent experiments in superconductivity, you'll recall that most of it is at a very, very low temperature, and it again involves this high state of spin. So in other words, look what we have. We have two counter-rotating drums, which incidentally are spinning mechanically at a very high rate of spin. We're using a serum that is probably a compound of mercury and perhaps thorium-229 isomer. We're cryogenically cooling it. Now there's another little element that's very important here, and that's the sound that it makes. The Germans also kind of nicknamed this device Der Bienenstock, the beehive. And the reason I think it's making these sounds, and again I outline a more detailed case in my books, but basically the Germans are using two kinds of electrical potential, alternating current and extremely high voltage direct current. And it's being pulsed. There's a direct current switch that's being opened and closed extremely fast, so it gives off that characteristic buzzing sound that you hear associated with direct current electricity. Now here's an important point to bear in mind, is the observed effects. When they tested the Bell on plants, plants were seen to decay within a matter of hours to weeks to a mere kind of brownish gray goo. And they did so without putrefaction. They just literally fell apart. When it was tested for the first time in the presence of humans, 7 of the scientists themselves that were involved with the project died. Subsequently, when tested in the presence of human beings, including concentration camp victims, but even some of the German technical personnel themselves, they would report having experiences of vertigo, of sensations on their skin, of little needles prickling their skin. They would have a metallic taste in their mouths, which is an effect, incidentally, that I actually read a similar thing in one of Timothy Good's books, which kind of interested me, because you have kind of the same effect being described by this device. Some of the concentration camp victims from the camp of Gross Rosen that were involved with this project observed at night what they describe as barrel-like devices ascending above the tree lines where the bell was being tested, ascending above the tree lines with a kind of a pale blue glow, and then it would settle slowly back down under the tree line. So in other words, one of the observed effects of this device was precisely levitation, or if you prefer, anti-gravity. But please note something here. I'm stressing these effects because obviously it's deadly to humans. So we have here a prototype technology, and I'll show you in a moment why I think the Germans took it so far, but so far only. We have here kind of a prototype technology in field propulsion, but it's not yet a practical flying craft, okay? Because they do not really know how to control these effects on organic matter. Now, the next interesting thing about the bell, I'm just kind of giving you the data points, and we'll see what it all sums up to in a moment. It was tested partly underground and then partly above ground. But when it was tested underground, it was tested in a deep mine, in a cavern, a chamber that was made specially for the purpose, in a deep mine underground. This chamber was lined with ceramic bricks, and over these ceramic bricks they had to place rubber mats. And after each test of the device, these rubber mats had to be removed and burned, and then the entire place had to be scrubbed down with brine. And that was a task that usually fell to the concentration camp inmates, again indicating that there was some risk involved in that procedure. Now here's an interesting clue, and this is the reason why I think that this device was using high voltage direct current in addition to alternating current, and that is that the Germans specially built an entire electrical power plant at the facility that the bell was being tested at. Now, there's absolutely no reason for them to do so if all they're using is alternating current, because, of course, you can step it up at transforming stations from wherever your power source is. And, of course, this means, you know the old Edison problem. Edison and his direct current electricity plan for the United States, that basically would have had us ending up with a power plant about every 2 or 3 miles. It would have been an environmental disaster. Unfortunately, Nikola Tesla saved us from that. But this is the indicator that we're dealing here most likely with something that required enormous amounts of high voltage direct current electricity, because that falls off. The further you get away from the power source, the amount of power available to you falls off very quickly and dramatically. So it had to be built very close to the facility. And that indicates also that they could not get the power levels simply from large amounts of capacitors or batteries. The location where the bell is tested is in a little town called Ludwigsdorf in Lower Silesia, which is a part of Germany. If you remember the pre-war maps of Germany, it's that little part, kind of a finger, that stuck down between Poland and Czechoslovakia. That's Silesia. The town is now called Ludwikowice in Poland. Now, this is the headquarters for where it's tested. This is Schloss Fürstenstein in the same region of Silesia. This is a photo courtesy of my friend Igor Vitkovsky, who's actually the fellow that broke the story of the bell, by the way. And you'll notice around here that there's lots of trees. It's very hilly, very rugged. And underneath this castle, the SS had built a veritable rat's run of tunnels and galleries and chambers and so on. So in other words, this whole area under here is just honeycombed with secret underground installations. And there's also a mine that is part of this whole facility. Now here's a real interesting thing. I call this the hinge. Nick Cook and Igor Vitkovsky call it the fly trap, or whatever you want to call it. This structure is, I'd say, maybe 800 to 900 yards from the power plant. It's about 30 feet tall, maybe about 45, 50 feet wide at the top. Underneath this structure, it sits in a basin or pool about 4 feet deep, and out here to either side, around the structure, on the ground, is heavy concrete with ports all the way around this structure, ports for heavy-duty electrical cabling that ran into the structure from the ground. Now, there's some people recently that have started arguing that this structure was nothing but a structure for a cooling tower for a reactor. And my response is that no structure like a cooling tower requires heavy-duty direct current electrical cabling. No cooling tower sits in a basin or pool. And finally, this structure itself here has been measured recently with high amounts of radioactivity. And again, go back to the serum and the heavy-duty gamma ray emissions. This looks to me like it was the test rig for its outdoor testing, where people were seeing things ascending, barrel-like devices ascending and glowing a pale blue glow, which of course is an electrical signature of some pretty heavy voltage and ionization taking place in the atmosphere. Now there's another bit of data point I want to bring to your attention, and there are two personnel, interesting people, connected with the bell, and this bit of information I have just found out very recently, so you're some of the first people to hear this. Hubertus Strugholt was one of the medical doctors involved with the project precisely at that castle that I showed you earlier, where there were underground facilities that he was apparently involved in testing how to limit the effects of this device on human beings. So in other words, again, this is a signal that we're still dealing with a prototype technology. It's very advanced, but still it's in a kind of a prototype stage. We're not at the stage of something practically usable as a flyable craft. But interestingly enough, this same Dr. Strugholt ends up in this country as a paperclip scientist working in space medicine for NASA. Okay? Now here is a really interesting fellow. Yeah? This is Dr. Kurt Davis, standing next to his good friend Dr. Werner von Braun at NASA. Dr. Davis was a senior flight administrator for NASA at Cape Canaveral during the Apollo missions. Now here's the interesting thing about him. This man here is the very same man who designed the power plant for the Bell. His specialty is not even rocket science at all. It's high voltage, heavy duty, direct current voltage and measurement. Ask yourself this question. What is this man doing as a senior flight director during Apollo at Cape Canaveral? I ain't going to tell you. That's a little bit of commercial. This guy is the really interesting character. This is SS Obergruppenführer Emil Matsuv, basically a 4-star general. Now, folks, I'm one of those people who's kind of a World War II buff. There's not many names in the German, American, or British, or French, or Russian officer corps that are unfamiliar to me. But I can assure you that after almost literally my whole life reading about World War II, I have never, ever, to this day, found anything about this man other than his file is still classified, and he was the head of one of the departments that oversaw the Bell. And the department is precisely this thing, Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, research, development, and patents. The mission brief of this department of the SS, it was classified almost at the pinnacle of the Third Reich's classification system. The mission brief of this department of the SS was literally to scour all patent applications within the Third Reich and later occupied Europe, of course, and pull any patent from public view that had national security implications and turn it over to another department of the SS to develop. Now, that other department was an SS department called SS Entwicklungsstelle 4, SS Development Area 4. And the mission brief of that department of the SS, again, top secret, was to investigate free energy to make Germany independent of foreign energy sources. Now, I'm emphasizing this point because at the very conclusion of this presentation, I'm going to show you what's going on here, what the implications politically and financially of all of this is. It's very contemporary. The actual overseer of all of the secret weapons projects inside the Third Reich, including the Bell, the administrator, so to speak, is this man that I mentioned in the first part, SS Obergruppenführer Hans Kammler. This is his SS identification photograph, in fact. Now, this man headed a group called the Kammlerstab, the Kammler Group, or the Kammler Staff. And I want to talk about this man's resume. He's just a love. This is the man that designed Auschwitz. So you see, there's your connection between secret weapons and the camps. This man was also the head of the SS Building and Works Department. In other words, he supervised all construction that the SS was undertaking. That meant, practically speaking, that he could call upon a slave labor pool of about 14 million people, or victims. The mission brief of the Kammlerstab is very interesting. The mission brief was that it would brainstorm the necessary technology tree to second and third and fourth generation weapons systems and begin the groundwork, practical research to bring each of them to fruition. As such, Kammler essentially established a think tank, and it was headquartered inside the engineering division of the old Austro-Hungarian Imperial Munitions Works, the Skoda Works, in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, about 30 miles west of Prague. Now, Kammler, when he set up this think tank, freed all participants from any ideological adherence to Nazism and what it dictated for science. In other words, you were free to think absolutely outside the box, including the party-prescribed box. And he went further. He not only recruited top scientists from inside the Third Reich and later occupied Europe, but he started a top-secret science magazine. Isn't that cool? So that each scientist could circulate their top-secret papers and keep abreast of each other. Now that, you think, is quite a breach of security. Wrong. Because, remember our friend from part 1, Heinrich Gestapo Müller? The security for the Kammlerstab was under the personal control of Heinrich Müller, who had created a triple belt of security around this staff, this group of political and economic and industrial counterintelligence. In fact, the Kammler Group was never successfully penetrated by Allied or Soviet intelligence. We knew there was something in Czechoslovakia, but we didn't know the extent of it. And I emphasize something here. Hans Kammler was the head, once more, of all jets, infrared sights, computers, phased array radars, radar-absorbing material, television-guided missiles, wind cannon, lasers, atomic bombs, hydrogen bombs, fuel-air bombs, Bell, everything. This was a very powerful man. And given the extent of the research that his department is conducting, and given the extent of his access to SS plunder and slave labor, this man is in charge of a mega Manhattan project. Now you recall the other fellow from our unholy trinity was this man here, Heinrich Gestapo Müller, actual head of the Gestapo. He was a close and personal friend. Oops, seem to have lost my... Did it disappear over here? Where did we go? Well, behind? I can't see anything. Is it there? There, we got it. Okay, my bad. I found it. Thank you. Heinrich Müller was a personal friend of this man here, Martin Bormann. Remember him? Dick Cheney without the warmth and charm. Just a love. Now, the reason Müller and Bormann were friends is rather interesting. When Hitler was in one of his early political campaigns, his first mistress was his niece, Gaily Raubal. And she was found suspiciously dead of a suicide, and it appeared that it was Hitler's pistol that did the deed. And so Hitler went to his fixer, Martin Bormann, and Bormann said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Bormann went to his friend, Heinrich Müller, who at the time was a Munich chief detective, in charge of the investigation, and said, "Cover up some of this, would you?" And of course, Heinrich Müller said, "Sure," and later is rewarded with being the head of counterintelligence of Nazi Germany in charge of the Gestapo. So isn't that interesting? Bormann has something on Hitler. Miller has something on Bormann. They're all SS four-star generals, and they're acquainted with Hans Kammler. There's your unholy trinity: finance, security, advanced research projects. Now, what were the Nazis hoping to do with this Bell device? I believe that they were investigating hyperdimensional physics, and that their reasons or motivations for doing so were depending on three things: a theoretical component that was in the physics literature in Germany between the wars, an engineering component. I mean, you can have all the fancy theory that you want, but it may not be engineerable. So is this stuff engineerable? Can you make something practical with it? And then finally, interestingly enough, the esoteric component, or if you will, the occult. Now, the theoretical and purely scientific component comes from this fellow. His name is Dr. Theodor Franz Eduard Kaluza. Some of you may have heard Michio Kaku on Coast to Coast, and every now and then he'll be talking about the run-up to string theory, and he'll mention this fellow, Kaluza, or Kaluza-Klein. This is the fellow that formulates the first post-relativity unified field theory, unifying gravity and electromagnetism. And he does so in a theory that involves 5 dimensions: 1 of time, 4 of space. And that extra 4th spatial dimension is kind of a very tiny, curled up dimension that makes his geometry, the geometry of his theory, a cylinder. There's your stacked cylinders in the bell, okay? That's the theory. And incidentally, he's not Jewish. Very important. This man stays in Nazi Germany during the war, okay? The really important component is this man, the engineering component. This fellow is probably unknown to most of you. His name is Gabriel Krohn. He is Jewish. He was a Hungarian Jew. He was a genius. He came to this country sometime during the 1930s. But in 1935, Gabriel Krohn, he's an electrical engineer, publishes a paper that wins him a prize, the Montefiore Prize, at the University of Liège in Belgium. And in the paper, what he is arguing is that all of these unified field theories that begin to come out in Germany, beginning with Theodor Kaluza, up to and including the early theories of Albert Einstein, what he says is that these theories are the hyperdimensional theories that can explain electrical anomalies that we electrical engineers observe in large, networked, rotating electrical systems. Now, please understand that what he has just told you is that these theories are engineerable practically on the laboratory bench. And remember what Einstein's theory was, which is a component. Relativity theory is a component of these unified field theories. When you say that these theories are practically engineerable on the laboratory bench with 1935 technology, you are saying that space-time itself is locally engineerable. And over the border in Nazi Germany, at that moment, publication of unified field theories inside the Third Reich stops. And the principal component of what he is observing as an engineer and saying, I can explain this with these hyperdimensional theories, is torsion. What's torsion? Well, for the mathematical out there, torsion, as you know, Einstein-Cartan torsion tensor, very small effect, usually negligible, you don't pay attention to it. There's another version called Ricci, dynamic torsion, but let's not argue mathematics. Let's get down to brass tacks. What is the concept? Think of yourself as holding an empty soda can, and you wring it like a dish rag. There's your counter-rotating metal drums, folks, in the bell. Opposite ringing motion. The can represents space-time. As you ring it, you fold and pleat the fabric of the can, and the ends of the can draw nearer to each other. That's torsion. That's those two counter-rotating drums, all that high-spin fuel in the bell. Now, what's the significance of what Krone said? Well, I've just told you, but historically, this is the period that you see unified field theory publications disappear inside the Third Reich. Krone himself ends up in the United States working for General Electric. I think you all know of a famous experiment on a ship involving electricity and rotating fields. This is the third element in Nazi thinking. If you can believe or imagine Heinrich Himmler having a Rasputin, this is the man. And actually, that's his nickname, Himmler's Rasputin. This is Karl Maria Willigut, also known as Weistor, also known as Jarl Vidar. He's a one-star SS general. He is on Himmler's personal staff. And the man is Himmler's personal occult expert. This guy was a well-known European esotericist. Published many things, many articles about astrology, about ancient texts, about ancient, space races, and so on and so forth. But here is his basic cosmology. What do we have? We have two counter-rotating spirals. Now, what does he say about this? Listen carefully. If you take nothing away from my presentation or my books, take this away, please. Behind many metaphysical texts, if you know the requisite physics, most of those texts can be decoded in terms of modern physics. And I would include many ancient Neoplatonic and Hermetic texts in that category. Willigut says this about those counter-rotating spirals, and I'll read it. You can follow along here on the left-hand side. Primal law. As above, above as below, below as above. Therefore, in the middle, there is a neutral force, idem est, generational field, from the two spirals. Each triply wound and connected by the generational plane, the middle field is developed to the world egg, unquote. Sounds kind of like an alchemist on LSD, okay? But look what it means. Decode it. The fabric of space-time, remember Krone as you listen to this, the fabric of space-time is not a mere void. Space-time is itself an information-creating field that creates precisely by creating systems of rotation within systems of rotation within systems of rotation. Many of you have probably heard Richard Hoagland. He'll tell you, what are the three laws of hyperdimensional physics? Rotation, rotation, rotation. What do we have in the bell? Counter-rotating drums, high-spin nuclear isomers, spinning electricity, pulsed direct current electricity. And the symbol of all of this rotational physics has been staring us in the face since 1933, if not before. The corporate logo of the Nazi Party. And for those of you with a mathematical or physics background, now think of this as a vector diagram. Because what do you have? A subsystem of vectors, the outer arms of the swastika, a system of rotation. And the inner arms of the swastika representing a system of stress, rotation and stress, in the medium itself, ringing the can with counter rotation. So in other words, in a certain sense, given the fact that all of these top secret SS departments were set up almost at the inception of the Nazi regime, you have a nation state that was dedicated to the principle of exploring the modern scientific applications of ancient lore and making it practically engineerable. That's why you have all the explosion of this technology that you do, because they were thinking utterly outside the conventional box. So the purpose of the Bell Project then was, in my opinion, to explore the theory and technology of creation itself. In other words, of the godlike ability to manipulate or engineer the fabric of space-time itself by tapping into the dynamic characteristics of space-time, its rotational characteristics. Now please note the implication. Such a technology, if successful, would obviously lead, number one, to so-called free energy and a complete and utter end to a dependence on petrodollars, limited non-renewable energy resources, and, for the Nazis, Anglo-American corporate financial predators. In other words, the very people that put the Nazis into power, the Nazis are no longer playing the New World Order game, ball game. From the get-go. Number two, obviously, given the testimony of people involved with the Bell Project in the camps that see this thing levitating, it leads to an anti-gravity field propulsion physics. But here's the real thing. This is what the Nazis are really after. Because its classification, again, is the only project in Nazi Germany to have the classification of Kriegsentscheidend, war decisive. Because if you weaponize this stuff, you have a potentially planet-busting technology that would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. What the Bell wasn't, it is not a mere isotope centrifuge for enrichment. I've heard that one. But sit down and do the physics, people. It is not a mere plasma trap, although through its use of that serum 525 and rotating it and electrically stressing and pulsing it, yeah, plasma is definitely involved. It is not a Nazi UFO, because there aren't people flying this thing that are inside it. I wouldn't want to be. It was not a time machine used by the Nazis to time travel. Although, as we shall see and have seen with the plants decaying, there are time dilation effects involved. What are we doing? We're ringing that soda can. It is not a Stargate or dimensional portal, though again, the physics implied in it does imply some very extreme shear effects in the actual structure of space-time itself. So, might that possibly result? Yeah. Did the Nazis actually use it for that purpose? Probably not, because we're dealing with a prototype technology. Were they successful? Did they achieve their goal? Again, to a certain extent, yes. We've seen the effects on plants. We've seen the effects on humans. We've seen the observed levitation. And all those effects are commensurate and condign exactly to the type of physics I've been describing to you, this extreme shearing effect in the physical medium. And incidentally, the final clincher is that one of the Bell's project code names was Project Chronos, Project Time. So let's sum up the physics. The dimensions, I don't think, at this juncture and stage of my research, I don't think served any practical functional purpose. The cryogenic cooling, yes, superconductivity, once again, high spin, high speed rotation. The counter-rotating of drums, again, torsion shear, high speed rotation. Serum 525. Plasma, yes, torsion. What's the sun? It's a ball of plasma that's rotating. And incidentally, the layers of the sun don't all rotate at the same speed. Physicists call it differential rotation. So the sun gives itself off torsion effects. And that means, and I wrote a recent book that just came out about this, that means that the standard thermonuclear model of fusion in the sun is not all that's going on in it. There's something else dealing with the nature of time and rotation itself. Probable use of thorium in this substance. Why do I say thorium? Briefly. When the Allies went into Nazi Germany and sent their intelligence agents scattered throughout the Third Reich, one of the big mysteries we could not explain, it made no sense to us, that's how inside the box we were, that here's the Nazis, you know, we've got the A-bomb, but these Nazis, these stupid idiots, are stockpiling massive amounts of thorium. And what are they using it for? We've never been able to figure it out, except thorium-229 isomer, to get enough of it to be of any use to you, number one, you have to have a very sophisticated technology to separate it. Laser enrichment. Number two, since it only exists in a few parts per million, you have to have a lot of thorium to isolate enough of this isomer to be of any use to you. Why the alternating and direct current potentials? Well, you spin up that serum in these counter-rotating drums mechanically and electrically. This is both quite important. And you use the drums themselves as one polarity in an electrical circuit, the center of the bell as the negative polarity, and then you pulse that plasma with an extremely high voltage direct current pulse. You've got all the atoms spinning in the same plane. You've got an isomer. You pulse it with high voltage electricity, de-excite that isomer, and as a result you create a kind of a little space-time bubble around this device. There's your levitation. And as that happens, all that isomer spits out those gamma ray bursts that are so deadly to things in its field. So that's kind of the way I rationalize this device on the basis of the physics. Again, what's the purpose of all this? Well, look at what we're dealing with. We're dealing with a unified field theory. So we have a unified physics implying, therefore, a unified technology which is capable of being used in three different applications: free energy, field propulsion, and the ultimate weapon. Now you'll recall before the break I mentioned that Bormann turned over to Hans Kammler, whose headquarters is in Prague, the last German long-range heavy-lift aircraft unit in the Luftwaffe, including one of these enormous Junkers 390 aircrafts. There's a picture of it. Imagine trying to hide that monster from snooping American or British counterintelligence agents. It's an enormous aircraft, again, capable of flying nonstop from Germany to Argentina. Well, interestingly enough, Kammler himself does an amazing thing. I wish I could do it. He dies 4 times, all on different days and on different circumstances. In one version, he shoots himself. In another version, he orders his aide to shoot him. In yet another version, which has kind of 2 subversions, incidentally, he either shoots himself in a forest outside of Prague or takes poison. And in the last version, he goes down in a blaze of glory fighting rebelling Czechs. Okay? In other words, you're dealing exactly as you are with Martin Bormann and exactly as you are with, incidentally, Adolf Hitler, with a story whose details are obfuscated and whose details have all been supplied to us by whom? Nazis. And the last Junkers 390 disappears after it flies from Prague to Norway and is never heard from again. It went to one of 2 places, according to Igor Vitkovsky and Nick Cook. It went to here, carrying Kammler and the Bell Project documentation. But I don't think so. This is the last picture of the Junkers 390 in Prague, incidentally, in April of 1945, being loaded up, made ready for a long-range trip. And you kind of get an idea of the enormous size of the aircraft. Where did it go? In my opinion, it went to Argentina because there's a little-known project in Argentina in a heavily Germanized area of the country in Rio Negro province around the little town of San Carlos de Bariloche. That's about 900 some miles southwest of Buenos Aires.